They call it laziness, that quiet refusal to move, that silence that others mistake for emptiness. But Carl Jung saw something different. He believed what we call laziness is often a soul in revolt, energy refusing to serve what isn't true. It waits, quietly, until life demands something real. And when that moment comes, the still one erupts, not from ambition, but from alignment. Chapter 1. The eruption behind laziness. Carl Jung believed that nothing in the human psyche happens by accident. Even the things we judge most harshly in ourselves, our procrastination, our passivity, our refusal to act, carry a message from the unconscious. What we call laziness, he thought, is rarely a sign of weakness. More often, it is a form of resistance, a subtle rebellion of the psyche against a life that does not align with the soul's deeper direction. Beneath that stillness, he said, there may be enormous energy, waiting, gathering, preparing to erupt. We live in a world that despises inaction. Productivity is praised as virtue. Movement is proof of worth. But Jung warned that a one-sided devotion to constant doing cuts us off from the deeper rhythms of life. The psyche, like nature, has its seasons. There are times for flowering and expansion, and times for retreat, silence, and inner gestation. When we ignore that natural rhythm, when we demand of ourselves endless output and measurable progress, the unconscious begins to resist. Energy withdraws from outer tasks and sinks inward. To the outer world, the person appears lazy, but inside something is quietly rearranging itself. For Jung, this withdrawal of energy was never meaningless. He called it the regression of libido, using libido not in the narrow sexual sense, but as a general term for life force, psychic energy. When that energy regresses, it doesn't vanish. It returns to the unconscious to reorganize itself. This is how the psyche heals, rebalances, and prepares for a new direction. Just as a volcano appears dormant while molten fire moves below, the soul, in periods of apparent laziness, is consolidating power beneath the surface. In this light, laziness becomes a symbol, not a flaw. It tells us that something essential is missing from our conscious life. Perhaps our goals are too shallow, our work disconnected from our inner values, our pace inhuman. Jung wrote that the psyche has a natural instinct for meaning. It will not release energy toward what it perceives as empty or false. So when the will pushes toward one thing and the soul pulls away, exhaustion sets in. The body refuses to cooperate. The mind drifts. Motivation evaporates. What we call procrastination is often the psyche's way of saying, not this, not yet, not like this. Jung saw this pattern in many of his patients. People who came to him describing paralysis, fatigue, or lack of motivation. The modern mind, he said, tends to moralize such states. I'm lazy, I'm weak, I'm failing. But Jung listened differently. He would ask, what is your laziness trying to tell you? He believed that when the unconscious withdraws energy, it is protecting us from wasting life on what does not belong to us. The apparent collapse of drive is often a form of psychic self-preservation. Sometimes this withdrawal precedes transformation. Jung observed that before major breakthroughs, people often experience deep inertia, a psychological stillness that looks like despair, but is really incubation. The old attitude has lost vitality, but the new one has not yet been born. The ego feels stuck between worlds, unable to go back yet not ready to move forward. Jung compared it to the alchemical nigredo, the black stage of dissolution that comes before renewal. In that darkness, The elements of the personality are melting, fusing, and preparing for new form. He once remarked, "When you are in the darkness, you are incubating the light." The same holds true for the so-called lazy person. What seems like stagnation may be the psyche conserving its force until it finds a purpose worthy of its energy. The problem is not lack of energy, it is lack of meaning. And when meaning returns, energy follows naturally. This understanding challenges the moral idea of effort for its own sake. Jung did not praise idleness, but he warned against the compulsion to act without inner necessity. He believed every action should emerge from the center, not from anxiety or social expectation. When activity becomes disconnected from that center, the psyche rebels. The individual feels drained, mechanical, or alienated. But when an action is aligned with the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, it is infused with vitality. Work no longer depletes, it nourishes. So how can we tell the difference between true laziness and the stillness of incubation? Jung would say, by listening. The lazy state is not silent if you approach it with curiosity. Ask, what does my lack of motivation want from me? Sometimes the answer is rest, a genuine need to recover from overextension. Sometimes it is redirection, the realization that your energy no longer belongs to an old goal. And sometimes it is transformation, a signal that your values are shifting and the old meaning has died. Jung's view also places responsibility on consciousness. While the unconscious may withdraw energy, the ego must respond, not with guilt, but with dialogue. To remain forever in passivity is to miss the message. The task is to interpret the withdrawal, to discover where the energy wants to go next. That's the difference between unconscious stagnation and conscious rest. In the first, we drift without awareness. In the second, we wait with purpose. This is why Jung's image of the volcano is so apt. A dormant volcano is not lifeless. Deep below, heat builds, pressure accumulates, and new minerals form. From the outside, it looks still, even dead. But when the eruption comes, it reshapes the landscape. Likewise, when psychic energy gathers in silence, it can later burst forth as creativity, clarity, or decisive change. The person who once seemed apathetic may suddenly act with extraordinary focus. Their apparent laziness turns out to have been the preparation for transformation. Jung also recognized that many people fear this inner eruption. The conscious mind prefers predictability. It distrusts instinct and passion. So it represses them, and the result is chronic fatigue. The individual lives by duty instead of meaning, by should instead of must. The more they suppress inner fire, the more lifeless they feel. Yet beneath that lifelessness, the volcano waits. Jung's advice was to approach this tension with respect rather than panic. The energy is not the enemy, it is the unlived life seeking expression. He often used the term the unlived life to describe the potential within us that never finds form. This unlived life does not disappear. It haunts us as restlessness, boredom, or apathy. The cure is not harder effort, but greater honesty. Ask yourself, what part of me has not been lived yet? For some, it may be creativity. For others, love, freedom, or spirituality. When you move toward that unlived part, motivation returns like water finding its source. In the end, Jung's insight reframes laziness as a moment of truth. It is not always an obstacle to overcome, but a message to decode. If we learn to listen, we may find that beneath every period of stillness lies potential energy, waiting for meaning. The psyche does not waste energy. It stores it until we are ready to use it wisely. So the next time you call yourself lazy, pause. Ask what that silence beneath action is trying to protect, what it's trying to grow. You might find that your stillness is not a defect, but a threshold, a calm before eruption, a waiting before renewal. Because the unconscious does not measure time the way the ego does. It moves in cycles, not deadlines. And sometimes, the soul needs to sleep before it can awaken. In Jung's language, the energy of life never dies. It only changes direction. If yours has gone underground, trust that it is not lost. It's gathering heat. And when the moment comes, when the purpose appears that feels true to the self, that quiet energy will erupt, transforming laziness into creation, inertia into movement, stillness into power. That eruption, Jung would say, is not an accident. It is the soul remembering what it came here to do. Chapter 2. The resistance of the soul. Carl Jung believed that the soul does not obey commands. It resists. It retreats. It refuses to move when the outer world demands speed, but the inner world demands truth. What many people interpret as laziness or failure, he saw as the psyche's instinct for protection, a kind of holy resistance that prevents us from wasting our life force on the wrong pursuits. We often imagine motivation as a matter of willpower, that if we simply push hard enough, we can overcome apathy. But Jung saw motivation differently. He understood that willpower is no match for the unconscious. You can push the body, force the schedule, write the lists, but if the unconscious does not agree, energy will vanish like smoke. The person becomes restless, tired, distracted, unable to focus. Not because they are weak, but because a deeper part of them has said no. Jung's entire psychology rests on one idea, that the human psyche seeks wholeness, not success. Every time we stray too far from that inner center, chasing status, approval, or obligation, the soul begins to resist. It stops cooperating. And this resistance, though uncomfortable, is meaningful. It is a way for the unconscious to communicate that something essential has been lost. When a person feels drained, Jung would ask, "What does your energy refuse to do?" Because refusal always hides wisdom. The psyche may withhold energy from something that feels false or lifeless. It may be saying, "This is not your path." To the ego, that sounds like sabotage, but to the soul, it's an act of integrity. This is the paradox of inner resistance. The very state we judge most harshly can be a sign of the psyche's intelligence. The conscious mind wants productivity. The unconscious demands purpose. The friction between them, that sense of paralysis or fatigue, is the symptom of two truths colliding. Jung described this tension as a kind of psychic split. The ego, driven by outer demands, tries to move forward. The deeper self wants to turn inward. Energy flows in opposite directions, canceling itself out. The result feels like numbness. But in Jung's eyes, this numbness is never empty. It is the space in which something new is forming. The soul, he said, does not resist out of cruelty. It resists to protect what is trying to emerge. Think of the caterpillar before transformation. It stops moving, stops eating, and enters stillness. From the outside, it looks dead. But within, the entire organism is dissolving and reforming. The apparent resistance is the pause of transformation. Jung believed the psyche works the same way. When old structures collapse, when meaning breaks down, energy withdraws from the outer world so it can rebuild the inner one. That is why Jung often told his patients not to fight the resistance immediately. Instead, he urged them to approach it with curiosity. Don't try to escape it, he said. Listen to it. The ego wants to fix the problem. The soul wants to be heard. True change begins not with discipline, but with dialogue. The conversation between consciousness and the unconscious. He would ask, "What is your laziness saying that you have not said aloud? What is it protecting you from?" Often the answers revealed deep truths: fear of judgment, exhaustion from living someone else's expectations, grief that had never been acknowledged. Beneath the so-called laziness was a hidden wound, and the resistance was its guardian. To Jung, this was sacred work. He believed the psyche is self-regulating. When we push too far in one direction, the unconscious compensates in the opposite. If we become overly rational, it brings emotion. If we live only for others, it withdraws energy until we rediscover ourselves. In that sense, resistance is a kind of inner correction, the psyche's way of saying, "Come back." But few people know how to listen to this resistance. We've been taught to crush it, to measure our worth in output, to interpret stillness as failure. Jung called this the tragedy of modern life, the worship of progress at the expense of meaning. He warned that people who live without dialogue with their inner world eventually experience emptiness or burnout. The unconscious cannot be silenced forever. When we ignore the soul's resistance, it returns in stronger forms: anxiety, depression, physical fatigue, even illness. Jung observed that symptoms are the language of the soul. They are metaphors trying to become conscious. If you are too tired to do what the world expects, maybe the deeper truth is, you are tired of pretending. But there is another side to resistance: its creative potential. Jung noticed that once a person stops fighting their inertia and begins to understand it, something miraculous happens. The same energy that once refused to serve the ego begins to move again, but in a new direction, toward authenticity. This shift often marks the beginning of individuation, the process by which a person becomes who they truly are, beyond masks and roles. Individuation requires friction. Without resistance, we would never stop long enough to ask, "Is this truly mine?" The soul resists not to punish, but to redirect. It wants us to use energy in alignment with the self, the inner center that connects conscious and unconscious life. When that alignment is found, energy returns with astonishing force. The person who once seemed inert becomes alive, focused, creative. The volcano that appeared extinct suddenly erupts. Jung compared this renewal to the alchemical process of transformation. The first stage is nigredo, the blackness, the chaos, the refusal of life to cooperate. In that stage, we feel lost, confused, lazy, or numb. But this darkness is necessary because it dissolves the old form. Only after the blackness can come albedo, the whitening, the awakening of new understanding. Then rubedo, the reddening, the reignition of passion and purpose. He believed every human being goes through this alchemy, often many times. Each cycle begins with resistance, the soul saying no to the old life so it can prepare for the new one. The mistake is to judge this no as failure, when in fact it's a beginning. This means that what we call laziness may not be the opposite of productivity, but its necessary prelude. Without stillness, there is no eruption. Without winter, no spring. The psyche resists so that we might rediscover what truly moves us. Imagine then that the next time you feel unmotivated, you treat it not as a defect, but as a teacher. Ask what part of you is holding back and why. Ask what truth would move you if fear or obligation were gone. Jung believed that when we honor the wisdom within resistance, it transforms into power. He once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Resistance is that pain, the moment before awakening, when the old self cracks and the new self begins to breathe. To surrender to this process is not weakness, it is courage of the deepest kind. The soul resists not because it's lazy, but because it is precise. It knows what deserves its energy. And once that purpose is found, once the unconscious and conscious align, the energy that once hid in silence erupts into life, just as a volcano releases what it has stored for years. Jung would call this the reconciliation of opposites, the moment when effort meets meaning, when resistance becomes revelation. The volcano doesn't erupt to destroy, it erupts to remake the landscape, and so does the human soul. Chapter 3: The Hidden Fire of the Unlived Life. Carl Jung once said that every human carries within them an unlived life, a second self that never found expression. It is the version of us that never had the chance to breathe, the musician who became an accountant, the dreamer who learned to obey, the child who once wanted to explore, but grew into someone who only plans. Jung believed this unlived life doesn't vanish, it waits. It builds energy in the unconscious, quietly pressurizing the psyche like magma under the crust. He noticed that people who seemed apathetic or lazy were often those whose true life had been repressed. Their energy hadn't disappeared, it was imprisoned. Beneath their fatigue burned the fire of the unlived life, aching to erupt. This hidden fire is not destructive, it is creative. It is the will to live authentically, the urge toward meaning that refuses to die even when ignored. To Jung, the unlived life is not just a personal issue but a spiritual one. Every psyche longs to unfold its unique pattern, what he called the individuation process. When this natural unfolding is blocked by fear, conformity, or social pressure, the soul revolts. It withdraws its energy from the outer world, leading to inertia, apathy, or depression. What looks like lifelessness is often the soul conserving strength for the moment it can reclaim its path. He wrote, "What did you do with the life that was given to you? And what did you make of the unlived life that lies within?" To Jung, this question defined the difference between existing and becoming. The unlived life haunts us, not to torment, but to remind. It surfaces as daydreams, longings, sudden irritations, or inexplicable attraction to things that seem out of character. These are not random impulses. They are messages from the parts of the psyche that have been left behind. Imagine a person who once loved painting, but abandoned it for practicality. Years later, they feel restless and empty. They might say, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I have everything, but I feel nothing." Jung would say the painter within them still lives, unexpressed, unsatisfied, sending signals through fatigue and disinterest. Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only change form. If it cannot go outward into creation, it turns inward into stagnation. The result is the quiet misery of the unlived life, the dimming of vitality without clear reason. This is why Jung believed that healing begins not with discipline, but with honesty. The question is not, how can I be more motivated, but what am I ignoring? Often the energy we call laziness is the very life force we have exiled. The soul resists not because it hates movement, but because it refuses to move in a direction that betrays its nature. He observed that the unconscious compensates for our one-sidedness. If we live too much for outer achievement, it withdraws us inward through exhaustion. If we live too much in duty, it pulls us toward desire. This compensation is not punishment, it's balance. The unlived life demands its share of the psyche's energy. The longer it's denied, the louder it protests, through dreams, illness, or breakdown. Jung described midlife crises in precisely this way, not as failures of character, but eruptions of the unlived self. A person who built their life on what the world wanted may suddenly feel it all collapse. Their ambition, once fiery, cools to ashes. They can no longer force themselves to care. This collapse is terrifying, yet Jung saw it as the soul's attempt to liberate the buried life within. What you call the breakdown, he said, is the breakthrough waiting to happen. He compared this transformation to alchemy, the turning of base matter into gold. The base matter is our neglected self, the raw material of potential we have dismissed. When we bring it into consciousness, when we allow that fire to burn, it refines us. The process is painful because it means letting parts of the old identity die. But from that death comes renewal. The person who once felt paralyzed finds energy again. Not the anxious energy of fear, but the calm vitality of meaning. In Jung's view, the unlived life is also the source of creativity. The artist, the thinker, the reformer, all are driven by forces that once lay dormant. Their eruption into life is not sudden. It's the release of pressure that has been building in silence for years. Creativity, for Jung, is the psyche's natural response to repression. When what is suppressed finally reaches consciousness, it seeks form, in words, colors, movement, or ideas. That is the fire made visible. But not everyone allows this fire to emerge. Many fear it. To live one's unlived life means to disobey the expectations that once kept us safe. It means stepping beyond identity, beyond the comfort of who I'm supposed to be. Jung said this confrontation with the self is often experienced as chaos or danger, the very moment when people feel most lazy, lost, or unproductive. Yet he insisted that this discomfort is necessary. The unlived life cannot integrate itself gently. It breaks through. He often told his students, the greatest burden a person can bear is the unlived life, because it doesn't disappear. It lingers in regret, in envy, in resentment toward those who dare to live freely. To ignore it is to divide the psyche into two warring halves, the one that conforms and the one that dreams. True peace comes only when they are reconciled. So what does it mean, practically, to live the unlived life? Jung would say it begins with small acts of sincerity, following a quiet fascination, admitting a long-suppressed truth, daring to imagine what life could be if we were not afraid. The soul does not require grand gestures. It needs authenticity. When even a small part of the unlived life is expressed, the whole psyche brightens. The energy that was trapped begins to move again. This is why Jung saw purpose as the natural cure for apathy. When a person finds even one thing that feels deeply meaningful, it awakens the fire within. Effort becomes effortless. The same energy that once resisted suddenly flows with force. The volcano erupts not in destruction but in illumination. He warned, however, that meaning cannot be borrowed. It cannot come from imitation or external approval. It must be discovered individually. What is meaningful to you, Jung said, may not be meaningful to another. That is the essence of individuation, finding one's unique pattern and living it fully. The unlived life is not a mistake. It is the invitation to begin again. If laziness hides energy, then the unlived life is the reason that energy waits. It's the inner fire refusing to serve a hollow cause. The challenge is to trust that waiting, to understand that stillness is not absence, but incubation. The potential is real. It just needs meaning to ignite it. In the end, Jung's message is simple but profound. The fire you seek is already within you. It is not gone. It is hidden beneath what you've learned to suppress. Your task is not to create energy, but to release it by living more truthfully. Once you do, the so-called laziness dissolves like ash. What remains is movement born from authenticity, a steady, glowing power that no amount of external pressure can produce. The unlived life will always call to you, sometimes as longing, sometimes as fatigue, sometimes as silence. But if you listen closely, you'll feel it pulsing beneath the surface, a quiet reminder that your energy was never lost. It was waiting, patient as fire under stone, for you to remember what you were meant to become. Chapter 4. When Energy Sleeps, the Psychology of Inner Winter. Carl Jung often described the psyche as a living organism, one that grows, rests, and renews itself according to its own hidden rhythm. Just as nature passes through seasons, the human soul, too, moves through cycles of activity and retreat. Yet in a culture that worships speed and constant productivity, we have forgotten that inner life also needs winter. We call it burnout, apathy, or laziness. But Jung saw it differently, not as failure, but as a necessary sleep of the soul, a phase where psychic energy withdraws into the unconscious to regenerate. He noticed that when a person feels deeply tired or unmotivated, it often coincides with an inner transition. The ego, our conscious identity, has reached its limits. The old structures of meaning no longer work, but the new ones haven't yet formed. So the psyche retreats. It slows down. The outer world may see stagnation, but internally, something is quietly dissolving and reorganizing. This state, Jung believed, is not an illness, but a passage, the inner winter of transformation. In nature, winter is not death. It is incubation. Beneath frozen soil, seeds rest and roots gather strength. Nothing appears to move, yet the stillness is alive with preparation. Jung applied the same image to the psyche. He said that the unconscious needs darkness and silence to do its work, that when energy sleeps, it's never lost, only hidden. The night, he wrote, is the mother of the day. This insight came from his work with patients who felt spiritually or emotionally exhausted. They would describe feeling empty, detached, unable to care about anything. Instead of urging them to act, Jung would often tell them to wait, to stop forcing motion where the soul demanded stillness. He knew that when the psyche has withdrawn energy, forcing it outward only deepens the fatigue. You cannot make a plant grow by pulling on its stem, he once said. You can only give it warmth, time, and soil. That is the wisdom of inner winter, to allow the psyche its natural rest. But this is profoundly difficult for the modern ego. The ego fears stillness because it associates worth with movement. It believes that if we are not achieving, we are falling behind. Jung saw this as one of the great pathologies of modern life, the loss of trust in natural rhythm. He believed that true growth requires the courage to let energy ebb and flow. When psychic energy retreats, we feel disconnected from our desires. Things that once excited us now seem meaningless. Jung compared this to the alchemical nigredo, the blackening, a stage of psychological decay where the old self dissolves. In alchemy, this darkness precedes rebirth. In psychology, it marks the beginning of renewal. The soul cannot bloom forever. It must also compost. But few people endure this phase willingly. The mind searches for explanations. Am I depressed? Unmotivated? Broken? Jung would not deny that such states can be painful or even clinical, but he encouraged a deeper perspective. That sometimes depression is the unconscious demanding attention. Depression, he said, is like a woman in black. If she turns up, don't chase her away. Invite her in, offer her a seat, and listen to what she wants. To Jung, the psyche uses fatigue as language. When we refuse to listen, it speaks through inertia. The unconscious might be saying, "You've been living too far from your truth. You've ignored something essential. Stop moving until you can see again." The task of consciousness, then, is not to shame this stillness, but to understand it. If you observe yourself honestly during an inner winter, you may notice strange things. Dreams grow vivid. Old memories surface. You might feel drawn to silence, to solitude, to introspection. Jung saw these as signs that the unconscious is active, gathering fragments of the personality that have been lost. It's like the forest reclaiming a field after harvest. Energy withdraws not to punish, but to restore. He believed that every inner winter holds a seed of rebirth. The psyche doesn't stop growing, it turns inward. In time, that energy will re-emerge, but in a new form, clearer, truer, more aligned with the self. Jung compared this to the myth of Persephone, the goddess who descends into the underworld each year, bringing fertility back to the earth only after her time in darkness. In his view, we all experience such descents. To live consciously means to enter them willingly. Still, he warned of one danger, mistaking inner winter for permanent paralysis. Some people, fearing effort, hide behind the comfort of withdrawal. They use reflection to avoid risk, introspection to justify inaction. Jung called this spiritual bypassing before its time. The difference, he said, lies in intention. True winter feels heavy but fertile. False winter feels empty and stagnant. In the first, we listen. In the second, we hide. The way through is awareness. When you notice energy fading, ask, what is being born inside me that needs this silence? This question turns laziness into meditation. Jung insisted that the unconscious responds to attention. The moment you bring curiosity to your stillness, the process begins to transform. Waiting becomes participating. Over time, patterns start to shift. You may find yourself pulled toward different ideas, relationships, or creative impulses. This is the psyche thawing, energy returning from its sleep. Jung called such moments renewal from the self, and they rarely happen by will. They come naturally, often after long patience, like the first green shoot through snow. To honor this cycle, Jung recommended a rhythm of inner listening, retreat and return, silence and action. The psyche, he said, moves between opposites, expansion and contraction, engagement and withdrawal. The wise person learns to dance between them. Too much doing, and we lose depth. Too much stillness, and we lose motion. Wholeness lies in balance. He also taught that inner winter has value beyond personal renewal. In stillness, consciousness deepens. We see patterns we missed before, the ways we run from meaning, the illusions that drive us. This clarity often leads to profound change. Jung's own creative breakthroughs came during such periods of inner retreat. His Red Book, a record of his dialogues with the unconscious, was born during a time when he withdrew entirely from his outer ambitions. That descent into darkness became the foundation of all his later work. Jung's view challenges the modern obsession with constant productivity. He saw that the psyche's greatest transformations occur not in the light of doing, but in the darkness of being. The tree does not grow during the storm. It grows in the quiet afterward. Our culture fears this quiet because it cannot measure it. But Jung's psychology insists, meaning cannot be rushed. He believed that the return of energy is inevitable if we respect the process. You do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness of inner winter is not the enemy. It is the womb of awakening. So if you find yourself in that heavy silence, unable to move, unable to care, resist the urge to condemn it. Ask what part of you is sleeping and why. Perhaps your energy has not abandoned you. It has gone home to rest. Perhaps your stillness is not weakness, but wisdom. The volcano that sleeps is not dead. Beneath its surface, molten life still churns, waiting for the moment when the world above is ready for renewal. The same is true of you. In time, the thaw will come. The energy that withdrew will return. And when it does, it will not be the same as before. It will be refined, redirected, aligned with who you have become. Jung would say that this is the soul's rhythm, the descent before ascent, the silence before speech, the sleep before eruption. To understand it is to make peace with life itself, not as a straight line of effort, but as a circle of becoming. Your energy is not lost, it is sleeping, and every inner winter, however cold, carries within it the promise of spring. Chapter 5. The Meaning of Rest. Why the Soul Refuses to Rush. Carl Jung believed that rest is not simply the absence of work. It is a sacred interval, a psychological act as necessary as dreaming. Just as the body restores itself through sleep, the psyche restores itself through stillness. But this kind of rest is not the shallow break we take between tasks. Jung meant something deeper. The rest that comes when the ego stops fighting the natural pace of the soul. To Jung, the soul moves according to its own time. He called this rhythm kairos, the right moment, the inner season, distinct from the mechanical clock time of the outer world. When we try to live only by chronos, by the ticking of deadlines and expectations, we lose touch with that deeper rhythm. The unconscious begins to resist. It slows us down, empties our motivation, forces us into pause. The ego interprets this as failure, but the soul calls it necessity. He wrote, "There are times when one must let things happen. The process of the unconscious is not in our hands." That sentence captures his philosophy of rest. It is not laziness, but trust, a surrender to the wisdom that guides growth from below the surface. The psyche does not evolve by constant doing. It transforms through cycles of tension and release, motion and stillness. To rest is to let that process breathe. Yet in modern life, rest has become guilt. We fear it. We feel unworthy of it. We believe, secretly, that our value disappears when we stop producing. Jung saw this collective anxiety as a symptom of one-sidedness, an inflation of the ego's will. The ego believes it must control everything, but the unconscious reminds us that life cannot be forced. The soul refuses to rush because it knows what the ego forgets. That meaning cannot be made by speed, only by depth. Jung's concept of active waiting captures this paradox perfectly. He distinguished between passive idleness and conscious rest. In passive idleness, the ego collapses into distraction, trying to numb its anxiety. In conscious rest, we remain awake but still, receptive to what the unconscious is forming. It is the difference between sleeping through life and resting within it. The first avoids awareness, the second deepens it. He compared this state to meditation, though he rarely used that word. When we rest consciously, we let go of control long enough for the deeper currents of the psyche to reorganize themselves. Thoughts drift like leaves on water. New images, new connections begin to rise. Jung believed this is how insight happens, not through strain, but through surrender. The greatest and most important problems of life, he wrote, are all insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown. And outgrowing requires rest. Think of the caterpillar once more. Before it becomes a butterfly, it dissolves completely into stillness. That stillness is not optional. It is transformation's cradle. Jung saw the same pattern in human growth. The moments when we stop, when we feel lost or unproductive, are often the moments when life is quietly remaking us. The ego, impatient and frightened, calls it stagnation. But the self, the inner center of wholeness, calls it incubation. This is why Jung insisted that every act of creation begins in emptiness. Artists, thinkers, and healers all pass through phases where energy vanishes. They cannot force inspiration. They must wait for it to return. Jung said that psychic energy behaves like a tide. It recedes before it flows again. The wise person learns not to panic when the water pulls away. They understand that the ebb is part of the rhythm. But how do we rest when everything around us demands movement? Jung would say the first step is humility. To rest well, one must accept that the psyche is not a machine. You cannot command inspiration. You cannot schedule insight. You can only make space for them to appear. The ego must bow to something larger, what Jung called the self, or the guiding intelligence of the unconscious. When we stop trying to rush, that intelligence begins to work on its own. He often compared the unconscious to nature itself. You cannot hurry a tree into blooming. You can only provide the right conditions: soil, water, patience. The same is true of inner growth. We must learn to rest without despair, to trust that unseen processes are unfolding. Jung called this faith in the process of becoming. He didn't mean religious faith, but psychological trust, a confidence that the psyche knows what it's doing, even when consciousness doesn't. He also understood that real rest is not escape. It is not about retreating into distraction or comfort. True rest, he said, is a turning inward, a willingness to face the silence. And silence, for most people, is terrifying. It strips away noise and leaves us alone with ourselves. That's why many people fill their lives with constant activity, to avoid meeting what the silence reveals. But Jung taught that this meeting is the beginning of healing. In rest, we confront what has been ignored, the emotions we've buried, the dreams we've postponed, the unlived life that still waits. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Rest creates the space for this meeting to happen. When the mind quiets, the deeper parts of the self can speak. we begin to sense what truly matters, what deserves our energy, and what no longer does. The soul refuses to rush precisely because it wants this clarity before action. Without it, we repeat the same mistakes, chasing the same illusions. In Jung's symbolism, rest corresponds to the element of water. Reflective, fluid, deep. The conscious mind, by contrast, is like fire, bright but consuming. When life becomes too fiery, too full of urgency and striving, the soul sends water to cool it down. That cooling can feel like loss of motivation, but it is healing. Water teaches patience. It doesn't force its way. It finds its path slowly, shaping stone over centuries. To live in balance, Jung believed, we must learn from water. We must allow moments when energy softens, when movement pauses, when we let things ripen instead of pushing them. He saw this as a kind of psychological ecology, the sustainable management of one's own vitality. Without rest, the psyche becomes barren. With rest, it renews itself naturally. One of Jung's most important insights is that the unconscious never stops working. Even when we rest, it continues its mysterious labor, digesting experiences, creating symbols, preparing new directions. What looks like inactivity is often the most fertile state of all. Just as the seed in the soil gathers everything it needs for spring, the resting psyche gathers the raw material for transformation. But Jung also warned, rest requires courage. It takes strength to be still in a world that equates rest with weakness. The ego will whisper, "You're falling behind." The world will echo it. Yet the soul whispers something else. "Trust me, I know the way." To rest, then, is to listen to that quieter voice. It is to stop running long enough for the truth to catch up. It is to rediscover the pace at which the soul moves, slow, deliberate, timeless. When we honor this pace, life begins to feel aligned again. Energy returns not through effort, but through resonance. We start doing the right things at the right time, not everything all at once. The inner and outer worlds fall back into rhythm. In this state, work feels lighter, purpose feels clearer. What once felt forced now flows. This is the paradox Jung loved most, that by resting, we move closer to what is real. By slowing down, we finally arrive. So when your energy disappears, when your motivation fades, remember this: maybe it's not time to push. Maybe it's time to rest. Not the shallow rest of distraction, but the deep rest of trust, the kind that allows the soul to breathe. Because, as Jung understood, the psyche has its own seasons, and if we never allow winter, we'll never see spring. The soul does not rush because it already knows the destination. The only thing we're learning is how to walk there in rhythm with it. Chapter 6. The Fear of Stillness. Why we distrust our own rhythm. Carl Jung believed that modern life had one great disease: restlessness. Not the physical kind, but a psychological one, a chronic inability to be still. He saw how people filled every quiet moment with noise, every pause with movement, every silence with distraction. To him, this restlessness was not a sign of vitality, but of fear, fear of encountering the contents of our own unconscious. He wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And that, he said, is why we fear stillness. When everything stops, when the outer noise fades, we begin to hear what has always been there. the voice of the psyche, asking uncomfortable questions. Is this the life you truly want? Why are you running? What are you hiding? Jung didn't see stillness as inactivity. He saw it as encounter. When we stop, the unconscious begins to speak. But the ego, terrified of losing control, calls that silence dangerous. So it keeps us moving, endlessly scrolling, planning, achieving, escaping. We live in what Jung would call a state of psychic exile, always active, rarely present. The soul knocks softly, but the noise of modernity drowns it out. He believed that this avoidance has consequences. The parts of the psyche we ignore do not disappear. They sink into the shadow. There, they gather energy and weight. The longer they remain unacknowledged, the more powerful they become. Eventually, they erupt as anxiety, depression, obsession, or burnout. Jung called this the return of the repressed. What we refuse to meet consciously will confront us unconsciously. Stillness, therefore, is not luxury. It is necessity. It is the way we prevent eruption by allowing gentle release. But to be still, we must first overcome fear. Jung understood that facing the unconscious feels like standing before an ocean at night. It's vast, dark, and unpredictable. We don't know what lies beneath its surface. But that's exactly where our power lies, in what we have not yet dared to know. He called the unconscious the source of life and the wellspring of energy. Every idea, every act of love or creation begins there. To disconnect from it is to cut ourselves off from the very source of vitality. Yet we do it constantly, by rushing, by distracting, by numbing. The irony, Jung noted, is that the very people who fear stillness the most are often those who crave meaning most deeply. They run from the silence that could restore them. In his work with patients, Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. People came to him complaining of exhaustion, meaninglessness, or anxiety. They believed something was wrong with them because they couldn't keep up with the world. Jung would ask questions that startled them. When was the last time you sat in silence? When did you last listen to your dreams? What would happen if you did nothing? Most would laugh nervously or look away. The thought of doing nothing frightened them more than any nightmare. Jung understood why. The ego fears what it cannot control. Stillness threatens the illusion of mastery. In stillness, we face our limits. We realize how little of life can actually be managed. And yet, paradoxically, it is only in accepting that limit that true peace begins. He often compared the psyche to a lake. When the surface is agitated, we see only reflections of chaos. But when the water is still, we can look deeper and see what lies beneath. The contents of the unconscious, the dreams, fears, memories, potentials, become visible. That is what stillness offers. Not escape from life, but deeper vision. However, Jung warned that encountering this depth requires courage. Stillness brings clarity, and clarity brings truth. It shows us the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. Many people resist because they sense, even unconsciously, that their outer lives are not in harmony with their inner truth. To rest is to risk revelation. That's why we call ourselves lazy when we slow down, because to stop might mean seeing what we've been avoiding. Yet Jung believed that this confrontation is the doorway to wholeness. Until you accept the darkness, he said, you cannot see the light. Stillness is that acceptance, the willingness to face both the light and shadow within us. When we stop long enough, the split between the conscious and unconscious begins to heal. The ego learns to listen rather than dominate. The self, that larger intelligence at the center of the psyche, begins to guide us again. He taught that the fear of stillness is really the fear of the self, the fear of meeting something larger, wiser, and more mysterious than our conscious identity. To encounter it feels like surrender, and the ego, which thrives on control, resists surrender at all costs. That is why Jung insisted that true stillness is an act of bravery. It means stepping beyond ego into a deeper order of being. For Jung, this process often began in dreams. Dreams, he said, are the natural language of the unconscious, the psyche's nightly attempt to balance what consciousness neglects. Those who fear stillness also fear their dreams, because dreams expose the truth. They reveal conflicts the waking mind denies. By listening to them, by writing them down, reflecting on them, we begin to restore contact with the parts of ourselves we've lost. Stillness, then, is not about doing nothing. It is about creating a space where inner dialogue can happen. Jung called this active imagination, a form of conscious stillness where the mind listens rather than commands. In this space, images, voices, and intuitions arise. The psyche begins to express itself. Over time, this dialogue transforms the person. They move from fragmentation toward integration, from compulsion toward choice. But modern culture has made such stillness almost impossible. We live in perpetual stimulation, screens, schedules, notifications, all designed to keep us from pausing long enough to feel. Jung foresaw this danger long before the digital age. He warned that the gods have become diseases, meaning that the ancient forces of instinct and imagination, once honored through ritual, now return as psychological symptoms. Anxiety, he said, is the price we pay for losing sacred stillness. He believed that restoring it is not complicated, but it requires intention. It begins with small acts, walking without your phone, sitting in quiet without music, observing your thoughts without judgment. These acts reconnect us to rhythm, the breathing of the psyche. As we practice, the fear of stillness fades. What once felt empty becomes alive. What once felt meaningless begins to whisper with purpose. Jung's psychology suggests that behind the fear of stillness lies the possibility of rebirth. The moment we stop running, the unconscious begins its work of renewal. Like a forest returning after fire, the psyche rebuilds itself from within. But this rebirth cannot be rushed. It comes when we have learned to trust the silence. He often told his students, "If you wait, the right thing will come." This waiting is not passive. It is faith in process, the understanding that growth unfolds on its own schedule. Stillness is how we align ourselves with that schedule. It's how we allow the deeper intelligence of life to guide us. In the end, the fear of stillness is the fear of life itself, of its mystery, its unpredictability, its depth. But Jung believed that the only way to truly live is to make peace with that mystery. When we stop fearing it, stillness transforms from threat to teacher. It becomes the place where we finally meet ourselves. Because what if the silence you're afraid of isn't empty at all? What if it's full of everything you've been searching for? That, Jung would say, is why the soul refuses to rush. Because in stillness, it remembers who it is. Chapter 7. The Shadow of Laziness. When avoidance hides desire. Carl Jung believed that laziness was rarely what it seemed. When people described themselves as unmotivated, uninspired, or unable to move, he suspected something else was at work beneath the surface. The psyche, he thought, never wastes energy without reason. Every withdrawal, every pause, every refusal hides a message. Laziness, in Jung's language, could be a disguise, a symptom of conflict between what the ego demands and what the soul truly wants. He once wrote that the human being is a bundle of opposites, constantly pulled between instinct and ideal, desire and fear, truth and role. When these opposites lose harmony, energy stops flowing. The conscious mind may want to act, but the unconscious has other plans. The ego tries to push forward, yet a deeper part of the psyche pulls back, unwilling to participate in something that feels false. From the outside, it appears as inertia. From within, it is resistance, a secret protest of the soul. Jung called this phenomenon the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the collection of all the parts of ourselves that we have rejected, repressed, or disowned. It contains everything we once were told was too much or not enough. Anger, ambition, sexuality, creativity, play, longing. We push these energies away to preserve our self-image. But the psyche does not erase what it hides. It stores it. The shadow becomes a reservoir of energy we have cut ourselves off from. Energy that eventually returns in disguised forms. Anxiety, boredom, avoidance, fatigue. This is why Jung believed that laziness sometimes conceals desire. Not conscious desire, not the tidy wants we can easily admit to, but instinctive, powerful desires that conflict with our social identity. The lazy student may secretly resent the path they've chosen. The exhausted worker might crave freedom rather than promotion. The artist who cannot paint may fear what will emerge if they truly let go. The soul does not cooperate with half-hearted lives. When we live against our nature, the psyche withdraws energy until we realign with authenticity. In his clinical work, Jung often asked patients who complained of procrastination to look for the hidden wish beneath it. What was being avoided? What would happen if they followed that inner impulse instead of the outer expectation? These questions, though simple, revealed complex truths. People discovered that their so-called laziness masked longing, the wish to rest, to create, to change direction, to say no. The psyche was not sabotaging them. It was guiding them toward a more honest life. To Jung, this guidance was sacred. He viewed the unconscious not as an enemy to conquer, but as an intelligence to collaborate with. When the unconscious resists, it does so for a reason. It knows something the ego refuses to admit. Perhaps we are following a path that no longer holds meaning, or suppressing emotions that need expression. Energy does not vanish. It only moves underground. The person who feels lifeless is often someone whose inner fire has been buried by fear or guilt. He described such situations as inner conflicts between duty and desire. The ego, trained by society, obeys the rules. Work harder, stay responsible, suppress emotion, be good. But the unconscious is older than society. It wants wholeness, not perfection. When duty suffocates desire, the unconscious rebels. The body grows heavy, the mind foggy, the will uncertain. This rebellion is what we label laziness. Jung saw it instead as honesty. The psyche refuses to waste energy on living the wrong story. This understanding demands compassion. Most people judge themselves harshly for being lazy. They force productivity through shame and discipline, unaware that they are fighting their own unconscious. But Jung argued that force never heals conflict. It deepens it. He advised his patients to approach their inertia not as a moral failure, but as a message. Do not try to overcome it at once, he would say. Listen to it. Ask what it wants. The moment you begin to listen, the shadow starts to speak. Often, what it says is surprising. Beneath laziness might live a forgotten talent, a repressed emotion, or an unacknowledged truth. Perhaps we are avoiding not the task, but the feeling attached to it. Perhaps we are resisting not work, but meaninglessness. Jung noted that when people rediscovered what felt alive within them, energy returned almost instantly. Energy follows meaning, he said. When meaning is lost, energy is blocked. Laziness is rarely the absence of will. It is will waiting for purpose. In his analysis of myths and dreams, Jung found countless images of trapped or sleeping forces, locked rooms, chained animals, dormant volcanoes, rivers turned to stone. These, he believed, symbolized psychic energy imprisoned by repression. The moment the dreamer faced what was hidden, the unspoken anger, the denied ambition, the buried passion, the imagery changed. Rivers began to flow again. Doors opened. Fire returned. The psyche was showing in symbolic language that confronting the shadow restores movement. He warned, however, that reclaiming this energy requires courage. The shadow does not release its contents easily. To integrate it means facing impulses that may threaten the ego's identity. Someone who prides themselves on being kind must face their capacity for anger. Someone who values control must meet their own wildness. Someone who believes they are selfless must acknowledge their need to receive. These encounters are uncomfortable, but Jung considered them essential. Wholeness demands that we include what we've exiled. Only then can energy flow freely. He described this process as shadow integration. It is not about indulging every instinct or abandoning moral values. It is about acknowledging that our vitality depends on relationship with the whole self, not just the polished part. Denying the shadow does not make us good. It makes us divided, and division always drains energy. When the conscious and unconscious are at war, life becomes effortful. When they cooperate, action becomes natural, almost effortless. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. He meant that true freedom begins when we stop fighting our own nature. The lazy person, in this sense, may be closer to transformation than the hyperactive one, because their psyche has already refused false work. They have stopped pretending, even if they don't yet know why. Their stillness, painful as it feels, is a threshold, a waiting space before the return of authentic energy. To pass through that threshold, one must ask, what does my avoidance protect me from? Sometimes it protects us from failure, from rejection, from judgment. But sometimes it protects us from success, from the responsibility of living truthfully once we know who we are. Jung saw this paradox often. People feared their own potential because it would destroy the version of themselves that others expected. So they stayed stuck, mistaking safety for peace. The price of avoidance is aliveness. He believed that the only real cure for this paralysis is honesty, not moral effort, but psychological truth. When a person stops pretending and admits their real desires, energy floods back in. The soul wants expression, not perfection. It wants to move toward what feels real. When it finds that path, it cooperates willingly. The same individual who once felt incapable of action can suddenly work tirelessly, not because they forced themselves, but because something within them has finally said yes. Jung often used the image of fire to describe this moment. The repressed desires, once feared, become fuel. The same emotions that once caused stagnation now generate movement. Anger turns to assertiveness. Desire turns to creativity. Laziness turns to focus. Nothing new is added. Only what was hidden is released. The person feels lighter, not because life has changed, but because their inner resistance has ended. He taught that this transformation does not come through analysis alone, but through experience. We cannot think our way into authenticity. We must live it. Facing the shadow means making small, real choices that align with what feels true. It means risking disapproval, admitting uncertainty, allowing ourselves to be human. In that vulnerability, energy flows again. The psyche rewards truth with vitality. Jung's psychology turns the moral view of laziness upside down. Where the world sees weakness, he saw potential. Where the world sees avoidance, he saw intelligence. The psyche is not lazy, it is precise. It withholds energy until the right task appears. That precision, once respected, can become our greatest strength. To live in harmony with oneself, Jung said, is to act from the center, not from pressure. It is to listen before forcing, to feel before deciding. The one who understands their shadow no longer wastes energy pretending to be who they are not. They live as a whole being, capable of stillness and movement, patience and passion. In the end, Jung believed that laziness is never just absence. It is a mirror reflecting the distance between our outer life and our inner truth. When that distance closes, the mirror disappears. Energy returns. Movement becomes natural again. The shadow no longer hides desire. It becomes its guardian. And the person, no longer at war with themselves, finally begins to live. Chapter 9. The Rebirth of Energy. When Meaning Returns. Carl Jung believed that all psychic suffering, fatigue, confusion, even despair, is ultimately a crisis of meaning. When life loses meaning, the psyche withdraws energy. It becomes heavy, colorless, unmoved. Jung called this psychic starvation, and he saw it not as a failure of will, but as a symptom of disconnection from the deeper layers of the self. But meaning, like energy, is never truly gone. It only hides. And when the inner conditions are right, when honesty replaces denial, when the soul feels safe to speak again, meaning returns as if it had been waiting the whole time. Jung called this return rebirth, and it is one of the most profound transformations in his psychology. He observed that this rebirth almost never comes through force or planning. It comes quietly, often after a long period of stillness or breakdown. The person who once felt lost begins to feel small impulses of aliveness, a curiosity, a renewed interest, a sudden sense of peace. They may not know why, but something within has started to move again. Jung compared this to the first green shoot pushing through the soil after winter. Delicate, easily overlooked, yet powerful in its inevitability. He wrote that the soul would rather be whole than good. This means that the return of energy often begins when we stop trying to live according to the false image of who we think we should become. The energy that had been locked away behind masks and expectations begins to circulate again the moment we reconnect with authenticity. The psyche, finally trusted, responds with vitality. The exhaustion that felt permanent begins to dissolve, not because life became easier, but because it became true. Jung often described this shift in alchemical terms. The black phase of nigredo, the darkness of confusion and despair, gives way to albedo, the whitening when light returns. In this stage, we begin to see patterns where before there was only chaos. We understand why we suffered. We recognize what needed to die so something new could grow. Meaning returns not as an external revelation, but as an inner coherence. The sense that life in all its contradictions belongs to us again. He saw this rebirth of energy as a natural outcome of integration. When the conscious and unconscious begin to cooperate rather than fight, energy flows freely. The person feels aligned, not split between what they show the world and what they feel inside. Even ordinary experiences, once dull or burdensome, begin to feel alive again. Jung called this the numinous quality of life, the sense that existence itself glows with quiet significance. He warned, however, that the return of energy can be misunderstood. Many people, after a period of paralysis, rush to fill their lives with new activity. They mistake excitement for purpose. But Jung insisted that real energy feels different. It's not restless or manic. It's calm, centered, clear. It does not demand constant motion. It simply invites right action. The person no longer feels compelled to do everything, only what matters. He used the image of a river to explain this. In confusion, the river overflows, flooding the landscape with chaos. In repression, it dries up. But when balance returns, the river flows naturally again, carving its path through the terrain of life. That flow is meaning, energy moving through form, guided by depth. Jung believed that when meaning returns, the whole personality reorganizes itself. Priorities shift, relationships change. The outer life begins to mirror the inner one. This is not a conscious decision, but a spontaneous adjustment. The psyche, having regained integrity, seeks harmony in the world around it. The person begins to attract what aligns with their essence and loses interest in what doesn't. This is why, after transformation, people often say they no longer recognize their old lives. It's not that the world changed, they did. He called this stage individuation's reward. It is not perfection, nor freedom from pain, but participation, a sense of being in dialogue with life rather than in conflict with it. Meaning is not a fixed answer, it's a living relationship. It grows as we do. Jung believed that once a person enters this state, energy no longer has to be chased. It becomes self-renewing. Even in difficulty, there's a quiet current beneath the surface, carrying them forward. He compared it to a fire that never fully goes out. Once kindled, it sustains itself. The person can rest without collapsing, act without forcing. They live from an inner center, not from external pressure. This, Jung said, is the ultimate sign that meaning has returned, when one's actions feel like extensions of being, not performances for approval. But meaning, he reminded, must be tended. The ego will always drift back toward comfort, forgetting what the soul once revealed. The work of consciousness never ends. It requires humility, a willingness to keep listening, to return to stillness. to remember that energy follows truth. Jung's psychology is not about achieving balance once and for all, but about learning the rhythm of loss and return, death and renewal. In this rhythm, energy becomes something sacred. It no longer belongs to ambition or fear. It belongs to life itself, flowing through us, shaping us, expressing itself in whatever way the self chooses. The person who understands this no longer fears silence or change. They know both are part of the cycle of rebirth. When meaning returns, it does not erase the past. It redeems it. Every failure, every delay, every so-called lazy moment becomes part of the same pattern, the path through which the soul learned to find itself again. Jung believed that this realization marks true maturity, the understanding that even our darkest seasons had purpose. And so, the rebirth of energy is not an explosion. It's a remembering, a return to movement that feels natural, effortless, inevitable. The volcano that once held its fire finally breathes again, not in chaos, but in light. The energy that once hid in shadow becomes creation, clarity, direction. Meaning is not something we find. It's something that finds us, once we stop running from ourselves. Chapter 9. The Courage to Move. When the soul finally says yes. Carl Jung believed that change never begins with strength. It begins with surrender. The quiet moment when the psyche, after long resistance, finally says yes. This yes is not loud or dramatic. It often comes after exhaustion, after all the effort and avoidance have balanced themselves out. The ego runs out of strategies. The masks begin to slip. And then, without warning, something deeper moves. For Jung, that movement, subtle, organic, and almost invisible, is the moment of real courage. It is not the courage to conquer, but the courage to trust what is emerging from within. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, he wrote. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The courage to move, then, begins when we stop avoiding. It begins when we allow what we've hidden, fear, anger, longing, truth, to rise to the surface and take part in our lives. He observed that transformation often follows a long period of paralysis. When the soul withholds energy, it does so for protection. The ego, with its plans and ambitions, keeps pushing, but the unconscious holds back. It waits until we are ready to live truthfully. Only then does energy return. Jung called this process enantiodromia, the reversal of direction. What was once resisted becomes desired. What once seemed unbearable becomes necessary. The psyche, like nature, finds balance through opposites. Many of his patients arrived at this point without realizing it. After months of feeling trapped, something shifted. They began to sense a quiet clarity. The same work that once felt empty began to feel meaningful. The same relationship that felt oppressive now felt worthy of effort. It was not that the world had changed, but that their relationship to it had transformed. They had stopped forcing themselves to live according to the ego's timetable and had started living in rhythm with the self, the deeper, organizing intelligence of the psyche. Jung understood that this change could not be commanded. You cannot will yourself into authenticity. You can only prepare the conditions for it. The The psyche moves when it is ready, not when the ego demands. That readiness comes through honesty, through the willingness to confront inner contradictions and accept them. When the conscious mind stops fighting the unconscious, energy that was trapped in conflict is released. That release feels like sudden aliveness. The person who once felt heavy begins to feel light again. He often compared this process to thawing after a long winter. The ground softens, streams begin to flow. The ice doesn't decide to melt. It simply responds to the warmth that was always coming. The same is true for the psyche. The courage to move doesn't mean breaking the ice by force. It means staying open until the warmth of awareness can do its work. Real growth is not a sprint forward. It is an unfolding from within. But Jung also knew that this stage is dangerous in its own way. When energy returns after a long period of repression, it can feel overwhelming. The person might rush to act on every impulse, mistaking movement for freedom. Jung warned that this can lead to chaos. The goal is not to explode into action, but to integrate the new energy with consciousness. The task is to move, but with awareness. Freedom without form is confusion. Courage without reflection is recklessness. The psyche must learn balance, expression guided by understanding. He believed that integration is what turns raw energy into creation. The volcanic force of the unconscious becomes art, love, purpose, insight. The soul doesn't want endless motion. It wants meaningful motion. That's why the courage to move is also the courage to move slowly. It is the decision to let life unfold, step by step, instead of chasing another illusion of arrival. In this sense, Jung's view of courage is the opposite of what modern culture celebrates. The world praises decisive leaps and visible progress, but Jung valued inner realignment. He believed that true courage means listening, even when everything in you wants distraction. It means trusting the uncertain path rather than clinging to what feels safe. And it means acting, not because you're sure, but because something inside has become too alive to ignore. He wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That sentence contains the essence of his psychology. The courage to move is the willingness to begin that becoming. It requires faith in a process we cannot control, and patience with a self that grows at its own pace. Most people, he observed, fear their potential more than their limitations. They fear that if they truly lived as themselves, their lives would fall apart. Jung's answer was simple. The life that falls apart is the one that was never real. He taught that this moment of inner consent, the soul's yes, often comes after despair. When the ego can no longer pretend, when every plan collapses, the psyche has space to breathe again. Jung did not romanticize suffering, but he recognized its purpose. Pain breaks the shell of illusion. In that breaking, new life can enter. What we do not bring to consciousness, he said, comes to us as fate. To avoid suffering is to remain unconscious. To face it is to reclaim authorship of our story. Jung's own life reflected this cycle. After his break with Freud, he entered a deep period of confusion and isolation. He stopped working, withdrew from the world, and confronted his own inner chaos. He later called it his confrontation with the unconscious. Out of that experience came his greatest insights, the foundation of analytical psychology. His courage to face stillness and fear became the source of creative power. He discovered that when the soul finally says yes, the eruption that follows is not destruction, but renewal. That renewal does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears in the smallest acts: writing a page, taking a walk, telling the truth. Jung believed that such simple movements can carry immense symbolic weight. Each small act of authenticity strengthens connection between the conscious and unconscious. The psyche learns trust. The person learns to move without losing their center. Over time, this creates a new pattern of being, one in which movement no longer comes from pressure, but from purpose. He called this pattern individuation. It is not the end of struggle, but a relationship with struggle that feels alive rather than suffocating. The person learns to navigate between stillness and action, reflection and risk, surrender and creation. Courage in this sense is not heroism, but participation, a willingness to take part in the life that is unfolding through you. When the soul says yes, fear doesn't vanish, doubt doesn't disappear, but they stop ruling the story. They become companions rather than enemies. The psyche, once fragmented, begins to work as one whole. The person can act and rest, give and receive, create and reflect, without feeling torn in two. That harmony is what Jung meant by living from the self. It's the moment when you no longer force energy, you follow it. You no longer chase meaning, you move with it. This is courage in its most mature form, not the courage to fight life, but the courage to live it consciously. To say yes to the soul is to trust that your timing, your rhythm, your path are not mistakes. It is to recognize that everything you have resisted, the stillness, the confusion, the laziness, were all steps in preparation for movement that now feels true. Nothing was wasted. Every silence was gathering strength for this moment. And so, when the soul finally says yes, the world doesn't explode into light. It exhales. It softens. The effort ends. The person who once felt paralyzed begins to move again, not faster, but freer. They no longer chase their life. They inhabit it. Jung would say that this is the quiet miracle of consciousness. The moment when energy that once hid in shadow returns to serve the whole. It is the volcano erupting not in chaos, but in light. The sleeping energy of years rising to shape a new landscape. The courage to move is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of life lived awake. Chapter 10. The Soul's Rhythm. Cycles of Withdrawal and Return. Carl Jung believed that the psyche, much like nature, lives by rhythm. It expands, contracts, rests, and renews. What we call progress, failure, energy, or fatigue are simply phases within this greater cycle, movements of a living system that breathes in and out. To him, the soul was not a linear path toward improvement, but a spiral, always returning to what was left unresolved, each time from a deeper level. He saw that life's apparent stops and starts are not interruptions to growth, but growth itself. This idea shaped his understanding of almost everything: creativity, healing, love, and even spirituality. Jung noticed that many of his patients suffered because they had lost faith in their own rhythm. They judged their inner world through the logic of the clock, expecting constant motion, constant clarity, constant strength. When energy disappeared, they panicked. When inspiration waned, they called themselves failures. Jung tried to teach them that the psyche has its own seasons, and that the most dangerous thing we can do is to force spring in the middle of winter. He described these cycles as movements of psychic energy between two poles, consciousness and the unconscious. When energy moves outward, we engage with the world. We work, create, communicate, love. When energy moves inward, the unconscious reclaims attention. It pulls us into reflection, solitude, and silence. Both movements are necessary. The first brings growth through experience. The second brings renewal through meaning. To stay only in one direction is to become unbalanced, to burn out in action or to drown in introspection. Harmony lies in the alternation between the two. Jung often compared this to breathing. The psyche must inhale and exhale. Inhalation draws life inward. The period of reflection, rest, and stillness when we gather energy and insight. Exhalation releases that energy outward, the period of expression, work, and communication. Yet most people, he observed, try to live in constant exhalation. They give, produce, speak, act, and rarely pause to receive. Eventually, the psyche rebels. It forces withdrawal in the form of fatigue, apathy, or even crisis. What looks like breakdown is often just the soul demanding to breathe in again. He understood that the modern world intensifies this imbalance. Society rewards visible motion and external achievement. Rest, introspection, or even boredom are seen as weakness. But Jung argued that these quiet phases are when the most essential psychological processes occur. Dreams, for instance, are the psyche's way of digesting experience. Reflection allows consciousness to integrate what has been learned. Without these phases, outer success becomes hollow, and inner life begins to starve. He saw this pattern vividly in the lives of creative individuals. Artists, thinkers, and mystics would describe alternating periods of inspiration and emptiness. When the creative fire dimmed, they panicked, thinking it had died forever. Jung reassured them that this ebb was necessary. What the psyche does not assimilate, he said, it repeats. The pause allows assimilation. The unconscious must have time to work below the surface, transforming experience into new symbols and insights. Once that work is complete, energy returns naturally, often in a form the conscious mind could never have planned. This, Jung said, is the deeper meaning of patience. It is not passive waiting, but active trust in the psyche's timing. To live according to the soul's rhythm means to cooperate with something larger than the ego. The ego wants control. It fears stillness. But the self, the totality of the psyche, moves with the precision of nature. It knows when to grow and when to rest. When we fight that rhythm, we experience friction. When we align with it, even difficulty begins to feel purposeful. He often used the image of the moon to describe this rhythm. The moon waxes and wanes, not by choice but by law. Its light is borrowed from the sun, yet it defines its own cycle of darkness and illumination. Human energy behaves in the same way. There are times of fullness when we shine outwardly, and times of darkness when we disappear into reflection. Both phases are sacred. The soul cannot remain in full brightness without losing depth, nor in darkness without losing form. Jung noticed that people who respected this natural rhythm tended to live more balanced, meaningful lives. They did not confuse stillness with failure or activity with progress. They understood that both were necessary expressions of wholeness. In therapy, he encouraged patients to observe their fluctuations in mood and energy without judgment. Notice when the psyche turns inward, he would say. Do not resist it. Something is ripening in the dark. He also recognized that withdrawal can be painful. When the soul retreats, the world can feel distant. Old interests lose their appeal. Relationships shift. The ego, accustomed to being in control, feels powerless. Jung interpreted this discomfort as evidence that transformation was underway. The old structures of identity, the roles, beliefs, or ambitions that once sustained us, are dissolving. The psyche is preparing to reorganize itself around a deeper center. "You must give birth to your images," he wrote. "They are the future waiting to be born." He saw this rhythm not only within individuals, but also within cultures. Civilizations, he argued, go through the same cycle of inflation and withdrawal. Periods of great expansion, technological, political, or economic, are followed by periods of reflection, crisis, and revaluation. When a culture refuses to enter its inner phase, it becomes spiritually empty. Only through collective introspection can it renew meaning. Jung believed that the modern age was precisely at such a turning point, materially rich but psychologically starved, restless because it feared its own depth. For Jung, the lesson of rhythm is humility. It reminds us that life is not a straight climb upward, but a wave that rises and falls. Progress does not mean constant ascent. It means movement through both ascent and descent with awareness. He often pointed out that even the process of individuation, the journey toward wholeness, unfolds in cycles. Each stage of insight is followed by another descent into the unknown, another confrontation with shadow, another rebirth. The pattern never ends. The goal is not to escape it, but to dance with it. He believed that those who accept this rhythm begin to live with a quiet kind of wisdom. They stop fighting time. They stop forcing clarity. When energy fades, they listen. When it returns, they act. They begin to see that both motion and stillness are forms of participation in the same unfolding process. Life ceases to feel like a battle and starts to feel like partnership. Jung himself lived this way. After years of intense intellectual work, he often retreated into solitude at his house by Lake Zurich. There he would carve stone, tend his garden, and record his dreams. He considered these periods essential to his creativity. "My life is the story of the self-realization of the unconscious," he said. That story, like every living process, required intervals of silence, times when he withdrew completely from the outer world to let the inner world speak. He warned that without such withdrawal, even the most accomplished life can collapse into emptiness. "People grow like plants," he said. "They need roots in the earth and exposure to the sun." The rhythm between these two, grounding and illumination, sustains growth. When we lose touch with either, we become unbalanced. Too much inwardness leads to isolation, too much outwardness to exhaustion. The art of living is to sense when to return and when to reach. Jung's philosophy of rhythm ultimately points to reconciliation, the realization that opposites are not enemies, but partners in creation. Withdrawal and return, death and rebirth, silence and expression are all phases of one continuous movement. The psyche, like the tide, does not judge the ebb or the flow. Both are necessary for the ocean to live. To live according to this rhythm is to live in harmony with the self. It is to understand that every pause contains a seed of return, and every return will one day lead back to stillness. When we trust this cycle, fear loses its power. We no longer chase constant light, nor despair at temporary darkness. We begin to live as the psyche lives, in rhythm, in balance, in acceptance. And when we finally learn to move with that rhythm instead of against it, life begins to feel less like a struggle and more like breathing. The seasons of energy and stillness, desire and rest, are not mistakes, but music. The soul plays them again and again, not to torment us, but to teach us how to listen. Chapter 11. The Sacred Pause. How Stillness Becomes Creation. Carl Jung believed that stillness is not the absence of life, but its incubation. What looks like emptiness from the outside is often the most fertile stage of all. A quiet phase where the unconscious gathers its forces, shaping something new before it emerges into form. He called this the creative pause, a sacred state of waiting that the modern world has almost forgotten how to honor. To Jung, creation did not begin with action, it began with silence. He noticed this pattern not only in individuals but in every living system. Trees do not grow in winter, they rest. Oceans do not rage endlessly, they breathe in and out with the tide. The moon wanes before it brightens. Every rhythm of life contains its own pause, not as a weakness, but as a necessity. The same principle governs the psyche. Energy cannot remain in constant outward expression. It must return inward to renew itself. That return, Jung believed, is the root of creativity. He once wrote, "There is no energy without opposites. For every moment of expression, there must be one of reflection. For every expansion, a contraction. Stillness is the unconscious half of movement, the other pole that gives meaning to action. Without it, life loses balance and creation becomes mechanical." To Jung, the most profound ideas, the most luminous works of art, are born from people who have learned to listen to the silence between their own thoughts. He called this silence pregnant emptiness. It is not a void to be filled, but a vessel waiting to receive. When the conscious mind finally stops demanding answers, the unconscious begins to speak in symbols, images, and intuition. Jung believed that this is how new insight enters consciousness, not through willpower, but through surrender. The creative mind, he wrote, plays with the object it loves. And play requires space, a pause in which imagination can move freely, unchained by logic or fear. In his clinical work, Jung saw that people often confused this sacred pause with stagnation. They came to him frustrated, saying they felt blocked, uninspired, unable to move forward. He would ask them to describe their dreams, and more often than not, their dreams would contain images of water, darkness, or gestation, a seed underground, a womb, a deep lake. These were not symbols of failure, but of incubation. The unconscious was at work. Jung encouraged them to stop forcing progress and instead to sit with the stillness. When the time was right, he said, movement would return on its own. He often compared this process to alchemy. The alchemists spoke of nigredo, the black phase, when the old form dissolves and nothing seems to happen. For Jung, this mirrored the psychological process of transformation. Before the new self can emerge, the old one must break down. Stillness becomes the crucible of rebirth. The ego, impatient and frightened, resists this dissolution, but the soul knows it is necessary. Creation begins not when we add more, but when we allow what no longer serves us to die. Jung himself lived through such pauses many times. After his separation from Freud, he entered one of the darkest and most creative periods of his life, and He withdrew from his professional duties, built a small house by Lake Zurich, and devoted himself to dreams, art, and reflection. He later described it as a descent into the unconscious, a terrifying yet transformative experience that gave birth to his greatest ideas. The Red Book, filled with visions and dialogues from this time, became the foundation of his later work. What seemed like a withdrawal was actually the gestation of an entire new psychology. He realized that the unconscious does not communicate in words but in images, emotions, and sensations. These messages often arise when we are still, in dreams, daydreams, and moments of solitude. Jung taught his patients to engage these images actively through a process he called active imagination. Rather than dismissing fantasies as meaningless, he asked them to dialogue with what appeared, to sketch it, write to it, or speak with it. In this way, stillness became conversation, and creation emerged as a response to the inner world. He believed that this form of creativity was not limited to artists. Every person carries an inner world that seeks expression, a storehouse of unspoken feelings, forgotten desires, and unrealized potentials. When we allow ourselves to rest in stillness, those potentials rise to the surface. The unconscious provides raw material. Consciousness shapes it into form. This interplay between the two is what Jung considered the true creative process. Not invention out of nothing, but collaboration between seen and unseen parts of the psyche. He warned, though, that modern life makes this collaboration increasingly difficult. Our attention is fragmented. Noise has become the default condition of existence. Endless screens, voices, and demands. The psyche cannot speak through such constant distraction. The greatest tragedy of modern man, Jung said, is that he cannot hear himself think. He believed that reclaiming silence is an act of resistance, even of healing. To pause is to reclaim authorship over one's own consciousness. In this sense, stillness is not merely a personal luxury, it is a psychological responsibility. Without it, we lose contact with the source of renewal. Jung compared this loss to cutting a tree from its roots. It may stand for a while, but it will eventually wither. To remain creative, one must return periodically to the inner well. Even short moments of solitude, a walk, a few minutes of reflection, can reconnect the conscious mind with its deeper counterpart. Over time, these small pauses weave a rhythm that keeps life alive. He also noticed that the quality of stillness determines the quality of what follows. Rest without presence, distraction disguised as relaxation, brings only emptiness. But stillness infused with awareness, with curiosity and openness, becomes sacred. It allows the unconscious to reshape us from within. Jung advised his patients to treat silence with reverence, as one might treat a wise teacher. When you stop filling every gap with noise, the psyche begins to fill it for you, with insight, clarity, and direction. He called this the art of waiting. Waiting, to Jung, was an active form of participation. It was not laziness or delay, but readiness, an alignment with the natural pace of the psyche. He observed that people who mastered this art developed an unshakable calm. They no longer panicked when inspiration faded or when life slowed down. They trusted that something was forming in the unseen layers of their being. When the time came, their action was simple and decisive, not forced, but inevitable. This, Jung believed, is the secret behind all genuine creation. Whether in art, love, or spiritual growth, Every transformation begins in stillness. The ego may call it emptiness, but the self knows it as fullness. The pause gathers energy, shapes direction, and prepares consciousness for renewal. When movement finally returns, it carries the wisdom of what has been learned in silence. He wrote, "In each of us there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves." Stillness is how we meet this inner other. It is the bridge between what we know and what we have yet to become. Every creative act, from a poem to a new life direction, begins with this meeting. The sacred pause, then, is not an interruption to living. It is living itself in its most profound form. It is the psyche gathering itself, reorganizing, preparing to give birth again. Jung believed that when we stop fearing this pause, when we enter it willingly, we discover that creation is not something we do. It is something that happens through us when we finally allow space for it to unfold. In a world obsessed with momentum, Jung's lesson feels radical. To stop is not to fail. To rest is not to fall behind. Stillness is how the soul breathes. And in that breath, the next chapter of your life, the one you cannot yet imagine, is already taking shape. Chapter 12, The Inner Fire, Transforming Stillness into Power. Carl Jung believed that stillness is not emptiness. It is transformation in disguise. Beneath moments of quiet or apparent inactivity, the psyche works unseen, distilling experiences, conflicts, and desires into something more concentrated. This slow distillation is how the human being turns stillness into strength, how reflection becomes power. He saw this process mirrored in alchemy, the ancient art of transformation. The alchemists spoke of turning lead into gold, but Jung believed they were describing a psychological truth. The lead was the unrefined material of the personality, our fears, contradictions, and insecurities. The gold was wholeness, the fully realized self. The fire that fueled this transformation was inner awareness, not passion in the modern sense, but the steady heat of attention that comes from facing one's inner world without flinching. For Jung, this fire arises only when stillness has done its work. The ego, accustomed to constant movement, resists silence. It fears the unknown that stillness reveals. But if a person can stay with silence long enough, without fleeing to distraction or false certainty, something changes. The tension between who we are and who we could be generates heat. Over time, that heat becomes transformation. Jung called this process the transcendent function. It is what happens when opposites, reason and emotion, control and surrender, light and shadow, are held together in consciousness instead of being split apart. The psyche begins to reconcile them, creating something new that transcends both. The person feels this not as an idea, but as energy, a slow, steady return of vitality. They are no longer pushed by guilt or fear. They are moved by clarity. He noticed that those who have faced inner stillness often emerge with a quiet kind of intensity. They no longer act from compulsion, but from understanding. Their words and movements carry weight, not because they are loud, but because they come from depth. Jung saw this quality as the true sign of psychic power, not the ability to dominate others, but the ability to live from one's center. The path to this center, however, is not easy. It requires courage to endure uncertainty. Jung warned that the fire of transformation is not gentle. It burns away illusions and exposes everything we've hidden. Many people extinguish it too soon by rushing to comfort. They interpret the heat of conflict as failure when, in truth, it is the very energy that can remake them. There is no energy without opposites, he wrote. There is no light without shadow, no ascent without descent. He believed that our deepest vitality is buried in what we resist. Every emotion we avoid, anger, grief, longing, contains power locked inside it. When we face those emotions directly, that power is released. It becomes creative energy. The person who can stay present with discomfort learns that pain itself can transform into purpose. This is the meaning of alchemy, turning what once hurt into what now heals. Jung called this inner fire the spirit of life within us. It is not something we create, it is something we uncover. It has always been there, waiting beneath fear and habit. When people reconnect with it, their energy returns effortlessly. They stop forcing progress and start flowing with it. The same stillness that once felt like paralysis becomes the foundation of new strength. Yet Jung emphasized that this fire must be contained. Without discipline, it can consume rather than enlighten. The alchemists used a crucible, a vessel strong enough to hold intense heat. For the psyche, the crucible is consciousness itself, our capacity to reflect, to observe, to stay centered amid emotion. Meditation, journaling, therapy, art. These are modern vessels that help us hold the heat until transformation is complete. He also warned that the fire has its rhythm. It cannot burn forever. After every period of intensity comes a natural cooling. The psyche needs time to integrate, to let the new structure settle. Those who try to remain in constant transformation end up exhausted, their growth turning into chaos. Jung advised his patients to honor both phases, heat and rest, movement and stillness. Power grows through rhythm, not through constant effort. As this inner balance matures, life itself begins to feel different. What once felt forced now flows. What once felt meaningless now feels connected. Jung described this as living from the self, the psychological state where all parts of the personality cooperate instead of compete. The person becomes whole, still human, still flawed, but unified. Their energy no longer leaks through conflict. It moves in one direction, toward expression, toward creation, toward life. He saw this as the deepest goal of human development, to burn steadily, without destruction, to act without losing one's center, to live with passion and peace at once. The one who achieves this balance radiates quiet authority. Their strength does not shout, it simply is. Jung believed that such individuals become lights for others, not by preaching, but by example. In the end, the inner fire is not something we ignite through force, but something we discover through stillness. It is the warmth that returns after long darkness, the energy that arises once we stop running from ourselves. Jung's alchemy was never about escaping pain or erasing shadow. It was about transformation through awareness. When we face what is dark, the darkness itself becomes fuel. Stillness, then, is not the opposite of power. It is its beginning. The person who learns to rest deeply, reflect honestly, and endure their own silence awakens something unstoppable, the quiet flame of being that cannot be extinguished. And when that fire finally burns clear, it does not destroy, it illuminates. Chapter 13. The Light That Waits in Darkness. Jung on Renewal and Shadow. Carl Jung believed that light is not found by avoiding darkness. It is born from it. He saw the psyche not as a battlefield between good and evil, but as an ecosystem of opposites, where growth requires descent as much as ascent. For Jung, the shadow, the collection of traits and emotions we repress or deny, is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a vital part of the self waiting for recognition. True renewal, he said, begins the moment we dare to turn toward what frightens us most. He described this process as a journey through the underworld of the mind. Every person, at some point in life, feels the call to descend, to confront the pain, shame, anger, or fear that lives beneath their everyday identity. Jung compared this to myths like that of Orpheus or Inanna, figures who venture into darkness to recover something lost. In his view, each of us carries a buried spark of life within the shadow, the part of ourselves that we rejected because it didn't fit the image we were taught to uphold. The task of individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires retrieving that spark. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." To Jung, the obsession with being positive, pure, or perfect is a subtle form of avoidance, a refusal to engage the full spectrum of human experience. Light without darkness becomes sterile. It lacks depth and compassion. Only when we integrate what we have exiled do we become real. In his clinical practice, Jung observed that many psychological crises, depression, anxiety, emptiness, arise not from evil, but from disconnection. The shadow contains powerful instincts, desires, and emotions that, when denied, turn inward as poison. A person who represses anger becomes passive or resentful. One who denies desire becomes numb. Yet when these same forces are acknowledged and expressed consciously, they become sources of vitality. The gold, Jung said, is in the dark. He often used dreams to guide patients through this process. In dreams, the shadow appears in countless forms: a stranger, an animal, a rival, a neglected child. Jung encouraged his patients to approach these figures not as threats, but as messengers. Each image represents a part of the psyche asking to be heard. A dream of conflict might symbolize a battle between one's ideals and instincts. A dream of darkness might signify the unconscious calling for attention. To engage the shadow means to enter dialogue with these inner figures, to ask what they want and what they are trying to restore. This engagement is rarely comfortable. The shadow speaks in symbols, not polite words. It may bring forward guilt, envy, or aggression, qualities we'd rather not see in ourselves. Jung believed that this discomfort is necessary. It is the friction of transformation. When we see our own darkness clearly, we stop projecting it onto others. We recognize that what we condemn outside us often mirrors what we've buried within. This realization doesn't make us weaker. It makes us more humane. Compassion grows naturally when we understand our own complexity. He saw this transformation as a form of renewal, a psychological rebirth. By bringing the shadow into consciousness, we free the energy it once consumed. The person who has faced their darkness does not become pure, they become whole. Their light gains gravity because it has roots in truth. Jung noted that such people often exude calm strength. They no longer depend on external approval because their sense of self now includes what was once feared. He described this process using alchemical symbolism once again. In alchemy, the stage following the blackening, nigredo, is called the albedo, the whitening, when light returns after darkness. This does not mean the elimination of the dark material, but its purification. Similarly, in psychology, renewal does not mean erasing pain, but understanding it. The shadow, Jung wrote, is 90% pure gold. Its integration does not destroy individuality. It deepens it. Yet he warned that the encounter with shadow can be dangerous if undertaken too quickly or without grounding. The ego must be strong enough to face what emerges. Those who plunge into the unconscious without preparation risk being overwhelmed by its contents. Jung believed that the proper attitude toward darkness is one of humility. We do not conquer it. We cooperate with it. We enter with respect, aware that we are meeting forces older and larger than our conscious will. He saw this humility as a spiritual act. By acknowledging the shadow, we acknowledge the wholeness of life, its cruelty and beauty, its destruction and creation. To deny darkness is to live in illusion. To accept it is to participate in reality. Jung wrote, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown." When we integrate the shadow, we outgrow the need to divide the world into good and evil, right and wrong. We see instead the interdependence of all opposites, the unity that underlies apparent conflict. This realization changes the way we relate to others. People who have met their own shadow are less likely to judge. They sense that everyone carries both light and dark, strength and wound. Jung believed that this is the foundation of empathy, not moral teaching, but psychological understanding. Only when we have looked into our own abyss can we hold space for the pain of others without trying to fix or deny it. He also believed that facing the shadow reconnects us with creativity. Many of the world's greatest works of art, he noted, arise from confrontation with darkness, from the artist's willingness to translate chaos into form. The shadow contains not only aggression, but imagination, instinct, and intuition. When these energies are repressed, life becomes gray. When they are integrated, the psyche begins to create again, in art, in love, in how we live. Jung called this creative renewal the return of the soul. It is the moment when meaning comes back after despair, when life feels alive again, not because pain is gone, but because it has been accepted as part of the whole. The person who reaches this state no longer fears darkness because they have seen what waits inside it, light, waiting patiently to be freed. He saw this as the essence of psychological and spiritual maturity. To live with awareness of both light and shadow is to live in truth. To carry darkness consciously is to radiate light responsibly. The one who does so becomes, in Jung's words, a vessel of transformation, someone through whom life continues to renew itself. The light that waits in darkness, then, is not a gift from outside. It is the energy of the soul itself, hidden until we have the courage to look inward. It is the fire that was buried during stillness, now burning quietly at the center of being. Jung's great insight was that the only way to find it is to stop running from shadow. Renewal does not happen in avoidance, but in encounter. And when that light finally emerges, not pure, but real, it changes everything. It does not blind. It reveals. It allows us to live as whole human beings, flawed, luminous, endlessly becoming. Chapter 14, The Self That Emerges. Wholeness Beyond the Ego. Carl Jung believed that the true purpose of psychological life is not perfection, but wholeness. He saw the human being as a vast, unfinished process, rather than a fixed identity. and he called that unfolding movement individuation. Individuation is not about becoming someone new. It is about becoming fully what one already is, including all the parts that consciousness has forgotten or rejected. It is the gradual awakening of the self, a center that is larger than the ego, guiding life from the depths of the unconscious. For Jung, this self is not an abstract idea, but a living reality, a kind of inner intelligence that shapes the events, dreams, and patterns of our lives in ways that exceed rational control. He wrote that the self is both the goal and the origin of our being. In other words, it is where we are heading and where we have always been. The ego, with its plans and defenses, believes it directs life, but the self moves quietly beneath it, drawing us toward situations and crises that force us to grow. Every disappointment, every loss of control, every descent into confusion is part of this movement. The self seeks to make us whole, and to do so, it must sometimes dismantle the structures that keep us divided. Jung believed that what feels like fate is often the self's intervention, the unconscious correcting the imbalance of consciousness. This process can be painful because it challenges the ego's illusion of autonomy. The ego wants clarity, success, and safety, while the self demands integration, complexity, and truth. The two are often at odds. The ego fears surrender. It wants to direct the story. But individuation begins when the ego learns to listen rather than lead, to cooperate with the deeper order of the psyche rather than dominate it. Jung described this cooperation as the reconciliation of opposites, not by choosing one side, but by holding both in awareness until something larger emerges. He illustrated this with the ancient symbol of the mandala, a circular pattern found in many cultures. For Jung, the mandala represents the self, a balanced structure in which all opposites coexist. He discovered that patients undergoing deep transformation often began drawing mandalas spontaneously, even if they had never seen one before. These circular images, he said, were the psyche's attempt to express inner order, a visual representation of the wholeness that was forming within. The appearance of such symbols in dreams or art signaled that the unconscious and conscious minds were beginning to align. In the later stages of individuation, the individual no longer identifies completely with the ego. They begin to sense the presence of another center, something wiser, quieter, and infinitely patient. Jung said this realization often comes through profound experiences of synchronicity, those moments when inner states and outer events align with uncanny precision. These experiences, he believed, are not coincidences but expressions of the self, reminders that our lives are woven into a larger pattern. The more attuned we become to this pattern, the less random the world feels. We begin to perceive meaning in places where before we saw only accident. This change in perception transforms how we suffer. The ego experiences pain as something meaningless, a violation of order. The self experiences it as initiation, an essential step in the process of becoming whole. Jung never denied the reality of suffering. He endured his own share of darkness and doubt. But he believed that when pain is consciously faced, it becomes a teacher rather than a punishment. In all chaos, he wrote, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. The task is to find that hidden order within our own lives. As the self emerges, the individual begins to feel both smaller and larger at once. Smaller because the ego realizes it is not the master, and larger because it participates in something vast, and mysterious. Jung described this paradox as the double movement of individuation, humility and expansion, surrender and empowerment. The person who once sought control learns to trust guidance that arises spontaneously from within. Intuition becomes sharper, creativity flows more freely. The individual acts not from calculation, but from alignment. Life begins to feel less like a struggle to impose meaning and more like a dialogue with something sacred. Yet Jung cautioned that individuation does not isolate us from the world. On the contrary, he believed that as a person becomes whole, their relationships deepen. They no longer seek others to complete them because they have reconciled their own inner opposites, the masculine and feminine, the rational and emotional, the spiritual and material. They meet others as equals, not as projections. Love, in Jung's psychology, becomes a reflection of integration, a meeting of two whole beings who share rather than merge. When people fall in love unconsciously, they project the unacknowledged parts of themselves onto their partners. When they individuate, they learn to love with awareness, seeing both light and shadow in the other without idealization or contempt. He saw this capacity for conscious relationship as one of the greatest gifts of individuation. It is also, paradoxically, one of the ways in which the self manifests, through connection. The more integrated a person becomes, the more they realize that individuality is not separation, it is participation. The self does not lead us away from the world, but back into it, reconnected through empathy and understanding. To live from the self is to recognize the same depth in others that we have found within ourselves. Jung's own life embodied this principle. After years of isolation during his inner transformation, he returned to teaching, writing, and friendship with renewed clarity. He spoke often of how his contact with the unconscious had restored his love for ordinary life. The sound of water, the faces of people, the patterns of clouds. Individuation, he said, does not carry us upward into abstraction. It brings us downward into reality. To find the self is to rediscover the world. He described this final stage of development as a return, not a transcendence. We do not become saints or sages. We become human, fully, consciously human. The self integrates the opposites that define existence: joy and sorrow, strength and vulnerability, creation and destruction. A person who has reached this point may still struggle, but their struggle is meaningful. Their actions arise from an inner equilibrium that cannot easily be shaken. They live as if guided from within, aware that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. In Jung's view, this is what spiritual maturity truly means. It is not escape from the world, but reconciliation with it. The self is both the divine and the earthly, the eternal and the personal. To align with it is to participate consciously in the rhythm of life, to experience oneself as part of the ongoing creation of meaning. Jung believed that this experience of participation is what religion originally tried to express, not a belief in doctrines, but a direct encounter with the living mystery that animates everything. When the self emerges, light and darkness are no longer enemies. They become partners in the dance of becoming. The individual no longer fears contradiction or change, because both are recognized as instruments of wholeness. The tension that once caused suffering now fuels creativity. The boundaries between inner and outer life begin to dissolve. Existence feels interconnected, rhythmic, and alive. Jung never claimed that individuation could be completed. He saw it as a lifelong process, one that continues until death and perhaps beyond. But he believed that even partial awareness of the self changes everything. It gives us the courage to endure uncertainty, the wisdom to see meaning in our struggles, and the humility to know that we are part of something vast and ongoing. To live beyond the ego, he said, is to live in conversation with the self, to move through life as a participant in a deeper order, a rhythm that unites opposites into harmony. The self that emerges is not a new identity, but a remembering of what was always there, the quiet intelligence at the center of being, the source from which both light and shadow are born. When we finally touch that center, life does not become easier, but it becomes real. We stop seeking perfection and begin living wholeness. The light that once seemed distant is recognized as something within, steady, ordinary, and eternal. Chapter 15. The Dance of Opposites. How the Psyche Finds Balance. Carl Jung believed that all psychological life is built upon polarity. Everything within the psyche, thought and emotion, reason and instinct, light and darkness, order and chaos, exists in pairs of tension. This tension, far from being a flaw, is what gives the human mind its vitality. Without opposites, there is no movement. Without movement, there is no life. Jung's great insight was that the psyche seeks balance, not by eliminating conflict, but by holding it until something new emerges. He called this creative equilibrium the transcendent function, the process through which opposites reconcile without one destroying the other. Jung's entire psychology rests on this principle. He observed that the unconscious constantly produces symbols, dreams, and fantasies that attempt to compensate for the one-sidedness of consciousness. When we lean too heavily toward intellect, the unconscious sends emotion. When we drown in feeling, it sends reason. The psyche, he said, has its own wisdom, always striving toward wholeness. But modern people, impatient for certainty, often mistake tension for disorder. We try to resolve opposites too quickly, by choosing one side and repressing the other. In doing so, we lose balance and inner vitality. He saw this dynamic everywhere. A person who prides themselves on strength often hides a fragile dependence on approval. The rational thinker who rejects emotion may become secretly ruled by it. The moral perfectionist who despises vice may become blind to their own hidden cruelty. Jung called this enantiodromia, the running of one extreme into its opposite. When the psyche becomes too one-sided, it swings back with equal force, restoring equilibrium through crisis. What we refuse to integrate voluntarily, life will integrate for us. To Jung, this was not punishment, but nature's law. The psyche, like the universe itself, operates through rhythm, contraction and expansion, ascent and descent, creation and destruction. Our suffering, he believed, often comes from misunderstanding this rhythm. We cling to one pole, refusing to move with the current. True balance comes only when we allow opposites to coexist within us, not as enemies, but as partners in the dance of becoming. He illustrated this with an image from Taoist philosophy, the yin-yang symbol. It shows light and dark in constant rotation, each containing a seed of the other. To Jung, this symbol perfectly captured the psyche's self-regulating nature. Every strength contains a vulnerability. Every vulnerability hides a potential strength. Growth depends on seeing both at once. Wholeness, he wrote, is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the opposites. In his work with patients, Jung saw how healing required this integration. When someone suffered from depression, he looked not only at what was missing, but also at what was overdeveloped. A person trapped in relentless productivity, for instance, might need to rediscover idleness and play. Another, consumed by idealism, might need to confront anger or self-interest. Each imbalance pointed to a neglected part of the soul calling to be acknowledged. Jung's method was not to suppress one side of the tension, but to help consciousness hold both long enough for transformation to occur. He compared this process to the joining of two chemical elements in alchemy. When opposing substances are contained together in a sealed vessel and heated, a reaction begins, unpredictable, transformative, and often volatile. The alchemists called this vessel the vas hermeticum. In psychology, the vessel is awareness itself. If we can tolerate the discomfort of contradiction without fleeing, the psyche generates a third thing, a new synthesis that transcends both extremes. This is the third path, the middle way that Jung called the transcendent function. This synthesis cannot be forced. It arises naturally, often through symbols that emerge in dreams or imagination. For instance, a patient torn between intellect and passion might dream of water flowing through fire, a symbol of reconciliation. Jung encouraged people to work with such images creatively, drawing or writing about them, allowing the unconscious to express what the conscious mind cannot yet articulate. Over time, these symbols help the psyche reorganize itself around a more inclusive center, one that no longer identifies solely with the ego's preferences, but with the whole of the personality. He noticed that this reconciliation changes not only how people think, but how they live. Those who once felt divided begin to move through life with greater flexibility. They no longer need certainty in order to act, nor denial in order to rest. They can hold paradox, to be strong yet vulnerable, confident yet humble, joyful yet aware of pain. This, for Jung, was psychological maturity, the capacity to live between opposites without breaking. The psyche, he said, becomes like a dancer, balanced not by stillness, but by motion, always adjusting, always responding to the subtle rhythm of inner and outer forces. He believed that the outer world mirrors this inner dance. The conflicts of nations, religions, and ideologies reflect the same inability to hold opposites that plagues the individual psyche. Society split into polarities: reason versus faith, freedom versus order, progress versus tradition, each side demonizing the other. Jung warned that if humanity does not learn to integrate its collective opposites consciously, it will do so destructively, through war and collapse. The same principle that governs the individual psyche governs civilization. What is not integrated becomes projected. To live the dance of opposites consciously, Jung said, one must cultivate awareness rather than judgment. Awareness allows both sides to exist without immediate reaction. It is a discipline of attention. To feel anger without acting it out, to sense fear without surrendering to it, to hold love without losing oneself in it. Such awareness is not detachment, but deeper participation. It recognizes that opposites are not problems to be solved, but energies to be balanced. Jung often found this balance symbolized in dreams as marriage, the union of masculine and feminine principles, which he called the conjunctio. This inner marriage represents the reconciliation of opposites within the individual, the active and receptive, the thinking and feeling, the conscious and unconscious. When these elements cooperate, the psyche achieves what he called psychic wholeness. Outwardly, this manifests as harmony, not perfection, but an organic flow between effort and rest, doing and being. He knew, however, that such harmony is never permanent. Life continually renews its tensions. Each time we grow, new opposites arise that demand integration. Balance, therefore, is not a static state but an ongoing dialogue. The goal is not to end the dance but to participate in it with grace. The person who understands this no longer seeks escape from conflict, but finds meaning within it. They see that growth happens through movement, not despite it. Jung's final writings return again and again to this theme. He saw in nature, in tides, seasons, and the rhythm of breath, the same law of opposites that shapes the human soul. The psyche, he said, is an image of the cosmos itself, a dynamic unity held together by polarity. When we align with that rhythm, we live more deeply and more freely. The task of consciousness is to keep that balance alive, to remain faithful to both sides of existence, the light and the dark, the ascent and the descent, the joy and the sorrow. The dance of opposites is not a theory, but a way of being. It teaches us to accept the whole of life, not only the parts we understand or prefer. It invites us to live consciously in tension, trusting that every movement toward one extreme carries within it the promise of return. To dance is to trust rhythm, and to live according to that rhythm is to participate in the wholeness that Jung called the self, the living unity that moves beneath all opposites, holding them together in an eternal, creative embrace. Chapter 16, The Self in the World, Living with Wholeness. Carl Jung believed that the ultimate task of individuation, of becoming whole, is not to retreat from the world, but to return to it, transformed. After the long journey through shadow, stillness, and inner fire, the final movement of the psyche is outward again, toward life itself. Wholeness, in Jung's view, was never meant to isolate us. It was meant to anchor us so deeply within ourselves that we could engage the world without losing our center. He often warned that people mistake enlightenment for escape. They imagine that awakening means detachment, that wisdom is the end of struggle. But Jung saw it differently. The self, the totality of our conscious and unconscious being, does not free us from contradiction. It teaches us to live within it. To be whole is to remain human, to feel pain and joy, doubt and faith, fear and courage, while recognizing them as parts of a greater harmony. The enlightened person is not one who transcends the world, but one who participates in it with awareness. He compared this state to the rhythm of breathing, inhalation and exhalation, withdrawal and return. The psyche follows this rhythm endlessly. It moves inward to reflect, to heal, to rediscover meaning, and then it moves outward to act, to create, to connect. The world nourishes the soul as much as silence does. Jung said that both solitude and community are essential to health. Too much of either leads to imbalance. Individuation therefore ends not in isolation, but in integration. The ability to live fully in the presence of others without losing the inner dialogue with the self. He believed that this integration manifests most clearly in how we relate to people, to work, to nature. The individuated person no longer seeks validation or dominance. They act from authenticity rather than approval. In love, they no longer project their own unmet needs onto others because they have recognized and integrated those needs within themselves. They can see another person clearly, not as an ideal or as an extension of their own story, but as a soul moving through a parallel process of becoming. Jung saw this as the highest form of relationship. Two individuals who, in their wholeness, allow each other to grow. Work, too, takes on new meaning once the self begins to lead. The ego works for achievement. The self works for expression. When life aligns with inner truth, even ordinary tasks begin to carry symbolic weight. Teaching, building, raising children, writing, or caring for others become ways through which the inner world shapes the outer one. Jung believed that the impulse to create, in any form, is how the psyche manifests wholeness. It is not ambition that drives this creation, but necessity. The need of the self to realize itself through form. He described this movement as the outward radiation of the inner center. Those who live from the self tend to leave something behind, not because they seek fame, but because the energy of the self naturally overflows. It seeks embodiment in art, service, relationships, or simply in the way one moves through the world. Jung thought that this radiance could be felt in people who had faced themselves deeply. Their presence carried a quiet gravity. They influenced others not through persuasion, but through being. This state of wholeness, however, remains dynamic. Jung never saw it as a permanent condition. Life continues to challenge and change us, and each new phase calls for another round of integration. The self is not a fixed point, but a living process, an ongoing dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, between the personal and the collective, between the individual and the world. The moment we think we have arrived, the psyche introduces new tensions to expand us further. Wholeness, like the self itself, is endless in its unfolding. He often illustrated this truth through myth. In countless stories across cultures, the hero who completes the journey must return home and live among others. But the return is never simple. The hero must integrate what has been learned in the depths into the fabric of daily life, to bring wisdom into the marketplace, to plant the fire found in the underworld into the soil of community. Jung said that this return is the hardest part of individuation, because it requires continuous humility. The world rarely recognizes inner transformation, and the ego can easily fall back into its old hunger for validation. The task is to serve without attachment to outcome, to act, knowing that the self measures success differently than society does. For Jung, living with wholeness also means accepting the world's imperfection. He did not believe that enlightenment makes reality easier. Rather, it changes the relationship we have with it. The individuated person understands that conflict, loss, and uncertainty are woven into existence. They no longer see them as signs of failure, but as expressions of life's polarity. Just as light needs shadow, growth needs limitation. By accepting this, we stop fighting the world's duality and begin to work with it. This acceptance does not lead to passivity. It brings wisdom. It allows action to arise from clarity rather than from fear. He described such people as carriers of meaning. They do not need to change the whole world. They embody wholeness in the small space of their own life. Their work, their words, their presence, all become quiet centers of order in a chaotic age. Jung believed that this is how the world heals, not through mass enlightenment, but through individuals who live authentically. If you take one small step toward the self, he said, the self takes 1,000 toward you. Each act of consciousness ripples outward, influencing the collective in unseen ways. In this sense, Jung's psychology is deeply ethical. It insists that inner work is never private. Every person who confronts their shadow, who listens to their unconscious, who learns to balance their opposites, contributes to the healing of the whole. The conflicts of nations, he believed, are projections of the unintegrated human psyche. When individuals begin to live with wholeness, those projections lose their power. Peace in the world begins with peace within the individual soul. This understanding transforms how we live day to day. Jung taught that the sacred is not hidden in temples or theories, but in the simple rhythm of ordinary life. Wholeness expresses itself through the way we speak, eat, walk, or treat one another. Each small act becomes a ritual through which the self continues to shape the world. To live consciously, to listen to dreams, to speak truthfully, to rest when tired. All of these are expressions of the divine pattern within human form. The self does not seek grandeur, it seeks authenticity. Toward the end of his life, Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That statement was not about identity in the modern sense, but about alignment, the merging of the inner and outer worlds, the integration of all that we have lived through. To become who we are is to let life express itself through us without distortion. When this happens, action and being become one. Work becomes prayer. Relationship becomes reflection. Silence becomes creation. The individuated person, Jung said, moves through the world as if carrying an invisible flame, steady, warm, unhurried. They no longer chase meaning because they live inside it. Their presence reminds others of what is possible, that peace does not come from control, but from integration. That strength is born acceptance, and that the truest form of power is the quiet radiance of a soul that has made peace with itself. To live with wholeness is to return home, not to the place we began, but to the awareness that has been forming in us all along. The journey ends where it began, in the world, among others, breathing, working, loving, and changing, but now with consciousness. The self, having led us inward through shadow and silence, finally reveals its purpose, to bring light back into life itself, until the two are no longer separate.